That in 1987, I was arrested and I went to trial. I made bad decisions during the trial, including committing perjury. And while I was in trial, I actually got indicted a second time. And ultimately, I had a sentence of 45 years. And that sentence of 45 years meant that I had a release date that was farther away than 25 years. And it was for that reason that I started inside the United States Penitentiary in Atlanta. Today I'm going to be speaking about why I went to a high security penitentiary when I was a young man. Now, before I get into this program, if you want to learn more about the criminal justice system, about sentencing, about the prison experience, then I would really encourage you to please subscribe to our program here at Prison Professors. I produce new video content every single day with hopes of helping more people understand what goes on inside of that system and, more importantly, how to emerge successfully. Now, I'd also ask that you might want to consider supporting our sponsors at cbdtv.com. They provide us with the resources that we need to produce new content every single day. Now, I want to help you understand a little bit about why I would start in a high security penitentiary, because I didn't have any history of violence. I didn't have any prior history of escape attempts or any prior history of any type of disruption or even weapon use in my crime. But the reason I went to a high security penitentiary is because the Bureau of Prisons is really the epitome of a bureaucracy. And that means it is governed by policy statements and program statements. And if you want to find more about those program statements, I would encourage you to visit bop.gov, where everything is published. And the more you learn about that system before you go in, the more you can arm yourself to make really good decisions and emerge successfully. It doesn't mean it's going to be easy, but by understanding it, you can take action to maneuver your way through that system effectively. And with regard to security levels or custody and classification levels, you want to look at program statement number 5100.08. Now, they modify that statement periodically. As you see, it was 0.8. This is the 8th version. When I first went into the prison system in the mid-1980s, I think it was like 5100.02 or 0.03. So over the past 3 decades, they've modified it a few times. The most recent modification happened in just September of 2019. Now, at the time that I went into the prison system, the Bureau of Prisons was supposed to hold you within 500 miles of your released state. I was arrested in South Florida because I lived in Key Biscayne, but my release state at the time was Washington State. They had that mixed up. So the penitentiary in Atlanta was the closest high security penitentiary to South Florida, and that was one of the factors on why the Bureau of Prisons sent me to begin my sentence inside the United States Penitentiary in Atlanta. The more important factor was my sentence length. If you've been watching the earlier videos about my journey through the prison system, you know that I started making really bad decisions when I was 20 years old, and you know that in 1987 I was arrested and I went to trial. I made bad decisions during the trial, including committing perjury. And while I was in trial, I actually got indicted a second time. And ultimately, I had a sentence of 45 years. And that sentence of 45 years meant that I had a release date that was farther away than 25 years. And it was for that reason that I started inside the United States Penitentiary in Atlanta. There was also another factor to consider that I think in full transparency you should know. Just before I got there, there was a riot inside of the penitentiary. That was in 1987. You may remember from history of the mid-1980s, Castro let a lot of people leave Cuba, and a lot of those people that left Cuba had criminal backgrounds, and the United States responded by locking them inside of the penitentiary, even though they hadn't been convicted of a crime in America. And in 1987, those Cuban people that were commonly known as the Marielitos, because they came from Mariel Harbor in Cuba, rioted inside of the penitentiary. And so when I got there, the penitentiary was in a state of rebuilding. And that means that there was no education system, there was no hospital as exists today. The housing unit was really that old style penitentiary. When I drove up to the penitentiary, I could see a lot of construction equipment on outside, but what was really had the most profound influence on me was this 40-foot high concrete wall that surrounded the entire penitentiary. And behind the wall, you could see this gigantic granite edifice that really looks like it is built to confine. On the street side of that wall, there was also a series of high cyclone fences with the coils of razor wire and concertina wire in the beginning. They were really making sure that nobody was going to escape from that penitentiary. And I always remember walking in there for the first time as a young man and just wondering, okay, what's it going to be like? How am I going to endure this? Making sure that whatever it takes, I am going to survive this and I'm going to emerge with my dignity intact. That was a focus I remember as I was hobbling up those stairs in chains with my wrists chained to my waist and shackles on my ankles. And we got in there, we went into a series of cages where they unshackled us and brought us through the processing system. And if you haven't read my book, Earning Freedom, I give a couple of chapters of what those first days, weeks, and months were like. But when I walked in there, it was really kind of overwhelming to see this huge cavern of a building with 5 tiers, and there were cages in the middle. So on the outside, you could walk around the flats. There was very bright red tile. The ceilings seemed to be so high because there were actually 5 stories, and you could look all the way up. And on the outside of the cells, there was a small catwalk, maybe about 2 feet, and on this side of the catwalk there was a chain link fence that would stop people from throwing other people off of the tiers. There was also, as I said, open bars, and inside of the cells, each cell, or most every cell, had 4 racks. 2 on this side, 2 on this side, and they were double, so there were 8 men in a cell, and in the center there was just an open toilet. So you couldn't be too modest in an environment like that. It's really where I guess I got conditioned to learning to live without privacy, because you have absolutely no privacy in that type of an environment. At any time, staff members can walk by, people walking by the tier will see you, and the showers were the same way. They were just a hollowed out area without beds, and they put a series of spigots, and that's where you would shower, just completely in the open. But when I got there, there was only about 500 people because they were rebuilding the penitentiary. And it took a couple of years before the construction really advanced far enough that population level rose to 2,500, 2,700 men. But they did build a beautiful facility as far as prisons goes, with brand new housing units, a new education building. They replaced those old cell blocks with the bars that you might see in an old prison movie. There was a new healthcare facility in the housing units themselves. They were I was on the 6th tier. So there were 3 floors. Each floor had 2 tiers on them. The flats would be on the main tier, and then there would be an open tier on the top. Each one of the rooms had 2 bunk beds in it, or 1 set of bunk beds, so there would be 2 men in the room. And inside the room was relatively small, with just the 2 bunk beds against the far wall, then a couple of lockers, 1 for each of us, a toilet, again, right in the open, a sink, and a little tiny strip of a window, and blasting air conditioning, which was great in Atlanta because the old style penitentiary had no air conditioning and they got very hot. So to survive in that kind of environment really takes a powerful mindset. It really takes an idea that says, I don't care what it takes to survive in here. I am going to survive, because this is a high security penitentiary. And when it transitioned from that construction period to a rocking penitentiary, it became the most, according to the New York Times, the most violent federal prison in the nation. And I knew several people that lost their lives inside of that penitentiary during about the 7 years that I was there. So, but I found that there is always a way to get through that level of volatility, and it's to focus on two things, and this is regardless of what type of prison you go to. You want to focus on getting the right job, because you spend most of your awake hours or a third of the day on the job. And if you have a good job and you enjoy what you're doing while you're on that job, it helps you pass the time. Now, that goes with different stages of the journey, of course. At the beginning of the journey for me, it was very important to get a good job because I wanted to stay busy. And the job that I pursued initially was in the education department. And then I think it was maybe after a year or so, maybe a little less, I transitioned to an office job that allowed me to focus on my studies. And while I was on that job, I felt great because I felt as if I were making progress. And I was also avoiding a lot of the volatility that was going on inside of that penitentiary. The other important factor besides the job is to secure a good roommate. And that's tough to do. Because it's tough enough to change our own behavior or to control ourselves, but it's impossible to control somebody else. So you really have to be careful in an environment like that to try and choose the best possible roommate. And that's difficult because every person in there is struggling with their own challenges. I was fortunate to get a good roommate and to be able to maneuver my way into a good cell. And I was also fortunate to be able to find a niche. And my niche was volunteering on suicide watch, because a lot of people in prison have mental health challenges, particularly in high security. A lot of people lose their will to live, and they threaten to take their life, or the staff members feel that they may be vulnerable to suicide. And I was a volunteer to be on a watch. And that didn't really mean that I had to do anything. They were just in a cell, and I had to make sure that they weren't strangling themselves. So I would just take my chair, park outside of the cell, and that's where I would do my homework from school. So it was a very productive time for me because I had a very, very solid routine. That's kind of the place where I started to develop this mindset of the importance of having systemic behavior and a strategy. And my strategy was to wake very early in the morning, focus on my fitness before the rest of the population went to the gym. I was very much into weight training at that time because I was in my 20s, and I focused on weight training, and that I'd start as soon as the door opened to go to the gym. I'd exercise, then I would go to my job in the office. Then after that ended around 4 o'clock in the afternoon or 3:30 in the afternoon, I would transition to suicide watch, where I would remain until 11 o'clock in the evening. So I got a lot of work done, but the real sweet spot was that by the time I finished my job, I was able to go back to my housing unit, and everybody else was already locked into the cell. So I was living in the penitentiary, but I wasn't really of the penitentiary. I was finding ways to prosper and grow. And during my free time on the weekends, I stayed really active, not only with fitness, but also with this program that I began there called the Toastmasters Club. And we called it the Olympian Toastmasters Club at the United States Penitentiary in Atlanta. It was because in 1996, as many of you may remember, they held the Olympics in Atlanta. But of course, the Olympics were in the news for several years. And so that's why I started that club. But it was one of the ways that I worked to develop more confidence as a communicator. I always believed that if I could learn how to communicate, if I could learn how to string words into sentences and sentences into paragraphs, I would be able to transcend those 40-foot walls and connect with people in society that I wanted to meet. And that early adjustment is really what helped me realize, well, what am I really missing in here? I mean, I'm living without things that I used to really place a high valuation on when I was in my 20s, fast cars and women and material subject-materialized. But it was in the penitentiary that I really began to find the value of developing a very strong mindset. And that's what I would encourage anyone who is facing a challenge with the criminal justice system, who is facing a sentencing hearing, who is facing potentially time in prison, or if you are in prison, learn how to develop a mindset. And if you like this kind of information, make sure that you're subscribing to the YouTube channel, because I produce this content every single day with hopes of helping people develop the same CEO mindset that empowered me while I was climbing through 26 years in federal prison. It was to, first of all, define success. What is it that I want to achieve while I'm here? The second component was, once I have defined success, to create a strategy that I could document and defend and say, if I execute on this strategy, I will emerge differently than what anybody else might expect from me. And then I'd have to create my tools, tactics, and resources. That is another component of the CEO mindset. Those tools, tactics, and resources will help me execute on the strategy and become successful as I define success, not as what anybody else is defining inside of the penitentiary. And finally, the third component of our CEO mindset is to be thinking about, how am I measuring my progress? And it was because I started that process very early on in the journey that I had a much more successful journey through prison than anybody might expect. And it might even sound ironic to somebody to say a successful journey through prison. But while I was in there, I earned an undergraduate degree. I earned a master's degree. I became a published author. I learned how to communicate and bring mentors into my life. I contributed into building a professional career that I later leveraged to open new opportunities when I came home. And it was the skills that I learned while I was in prison that allowed me to meet the love of my life while I was serving a sentence, to get married, and to start building a future with my wife. And we've been married now for more than 17 years. The first 10 were spent inside of the Bureau of Prisons. So I will provide new content every single day. I do hope that you will support the show by doing two things right now. Subscribe and leave a comment if there's something you'd like me to respond to. And then please support our sponsors at cbdtv.com. They have a subscription basis that will allow you to receive CBD products delivered right to your home. And that's what provides the resources for us to continue developing these programs every day, and for us to be able to use these programs to teach and inspire more people in jail and prison. That's the way that I am striving to be the change that I want to see in the world.